My wife started forgetting small things about 2.5 years ago. Her sister's birthday, the name of the street where she grew up, whether she'd already fed the dog that morning. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was just getting older. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies, not hers, but mine. Last Monday, I sat in Dr. Patricia Holt's examination room at the Neurology Center off Kingston Pike in Knoxville, watching my wife Margaret try to name the current president of the United States. She looked at the ceiling the way she does when she's searching for something she knows is there but can't quite reach. Dr. Holt wrote something down on her notepad. When my son stepped into the hallway to answer a phone call, the doctor set down her pen and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on a physician's face since the night our youngest was born premature. She folded her hands on the desk and said, very quietly, "Mr. Hadley, before your son comes back in, I need you to listen to me very carefully." Those 12 words rearranged the last 2.5 years of my life. My name is Thomas Hadley. I'm 67 years old, retired after 31 years as a structural engineer for a firm out of Charlotte. Margaret and I moved to Knoxville 11 years ago when I took early retirement, bought a house on Whitfield Drive with a yard big enough for her flower garden and a workshop big enough for my woodworking. We'd raised 2 kids in that house, our son Ryan, who is 39, and our daughter Claire, who lives in Portland with her husband, and our 2 grandchildren. Margaret taught 4th grade for 26 years. She knew every child she'd ever taught by name. She remembered the birthdays of our neighbors' kids, the anniversaries of couples we'd met once at a dinner party 20 years ago, the exact date we'd planted each rose bush in the backyard. Her memory wasn't just good, it was her gift, which is why I should have panicked the moment it started slipping. But Ryan had an explanation for everything, and I was too grateful for his presence to question his explanations. He'd moved back to Knoxville about 3 years ago, after his real estate development business in Nashville collapsed. The market had turned against him at the worst possible moment. He had 3 projects in the ground and no financing to finish them, and when the dominoes started falling, they fell fast. He told us he'd managed to settle most of his debts, that he was starting fresh, that all he needed was time and a quiet place to get back on his feet. He stayed in our guest room for what was supposed to be 3 months. He was still there when Margaret's memory started changing. I want to be honest with myself here, because I wasn't honest with myself then. Ryan was attentive. He drove Margaret to her appointments when I was at the workshop or at my Thursday morning breakfast with the retired engineers group I'd been part of for a decade. He organized her medications, set up a weekly pill dispenser on the kitchen counter, researched supplement brands online, and ordered them to the house. He cooked dinner several nights a week. He was, by every visible measure, a devoted son watching out for his mother while his father aged alongside her. I thanked God for him. I bragged about him at those Thursday breakfasts. I told Earl Whitmore, my closest friend and a retired sheriff's detective, that whatever had happened to Ryan in Nashville had turned him into the man we'd always hoped he'd become. Earl had nodded and said something I didn't pay enough attention to at the time. A man who changes his behavior that fast usually has a reason that isn't about changing. I laughed it off. Earl had spent 30 years being suspicious of people for a living, and it had left marks. Meanwhile, Margaret kept slipping. The forgetting became more frequent, then more severe. By 18 months in, she was repeating the same questions within 10 minutes of asking them the first time. She'd stop in the middle of a sentence and look at me with frightened eyes, reaching for a word that wasn't there. She stopped trying to garden because she couldn't remember which plants needed what care. She stopped calling Claire on her own because she couldn't always remember Claire's number, even though it was saved in her phone, and that terrified her. I took her to our family doctor first, then to a neurologist who diagnosed her with early to moderate cognitive decline of uncertain origin. He used the word dementia tentatively, said we needed to watch the progression. Ryan sat in that appointment and asked all the right questions, caring questions. He took notes on his phone. He suggested we see Dr. Holt for a second opinion. He'd read about her online, said she was one of the best in East Tennessee. I thought he was being thorough. I thought he loved his mother. The morning of our appointment with Dr. Holt, I watched Ryan prepare Margaret's medications at the kitchen counter the way he did every morning. He was methodical about it, precise. He'd explained early on that keeping everything consistent was important for elderly patients on multiple medications the same time each day, the same sequence, the same glass of water. I'd never questioned it. I barely paid attention anymore. I was making coffee, half listening to the morning news, thinking about whether Dr. Holt might have something new to offer. Ryan drove us to the appointment because my vision had been bothering me in bright light, and I preferred not to drive on unfamiliar roads. He sat in the examination room and answered several of Dr. Holt's preliminary questions when Margaret struggled, filling in details about timing and symptoms and medication names with the fluency of someone who had clearly rehearsed. Dr. Holt listened, examined Margaret, ran her through a standard cognitive battery. Then she asked Ryan if he'd mind waiting in the hallway for a few minutes while she reviewed some of the test results. He hesitated just a fraction of a second, not long enough to mean anything obvious, then stood and said, "Of course," and walked out. The door hadn't fully clicked shut before she spoke. "How long has your son been managing your wife's medications?" "About 2.5 years," I said. "Since her symptoms started," something moved behind her eyes. Not surprise, more like confirmation. "Mr. Hadley, I've been practicing neurology for 22 years. The pattern of your wife's decline, the rate of it, the specific nature of the symptoms doesn't match any of the common degenerative conditions I'd expect to see in a 64-year-old woman with her otherwise clean medical history. But it matches something else very closely." She turned the notepad toward me. She'd written 2 words: benzodiazepine toxicity. I didn't say anything. My engineering brain was already working the problem, and the answer it kept generating was one I didn't want to accept. Certain sedative medications, when administered in low doses consistently over a long period of time, can produce symptoms in elderly patients that are nearly indistinguishable from early dementia. Memory loss, word-finding difficulties, confusion, anxiety, emotional flatness. The effects are cumulative. They get worse over time as the drug accumulates in the system. She leaned forward. "I want to order comprehensive blood work today, specifically a toxicology screen. But I need you to understand that if what I suspect is correct, your wife may not have dementia at all." The room was very quiet. I could hear Margaret humming softly to herself, the way she did when she was nervous. "You're saying someone has been drugging her. I'm saying the clinical picture is consistent with chronic sedative exposure. And the most common mechanism in cases like this is someone with access to the patient's daily medications. I've seen it 3 times in my career. Twice it was accidental overprescription. Once it was deliberate." She held my gaze. "I need you to let me run the tests before you do anything else. And I need you not to say anything to your son until we have results." The door opened. Ryan walked back in with a coffee from the vending machine in the hallway, smiling, asking if everything was all right. "Just reviewing some options," Dr. Holt said. I looked at my son's face and tried to see what Earl had seen 3 years ago. The man I'd raised. The boy who used to sit on the tailgate of my truck while I explained bridge load calculations because he said he liked hearing me talk about things I loved. The man standing in front of me now, holding a styrofoam cup, watching his mother with an expression I had always read as tenderness, and was now reading in an entirely different language. I barely spoke on the drive home. That night, after Margaret was asleep and Ryan had gone to his room, I sat in my workshop and did what I always do when a structure doesn't add up. I went back to the foundation. I thought about the timeline. Ryan arrived 3 years ago, broke and in debt, and I'd never pressed him on exactly how much debt, because it felt unkind to dig into a man's worst failure. Margaret's symptoms had begun roughly 3 months after he moved in. He'd volunteered to manage her medications before there was any medical reason for him to do so, framing it as organization, as care. He gently discouraged me from pursuing a second opinion for over a year, suggesting that more appointments were stressful for Margaret. He'd encouraged me to take on a consulting contract in Cincinnati last fall that kept me away for 6 weeks. "Dad, I'm here. We'll be fine. You've been retired for too long. You need to stay sharp." He'd started asking, in the last year, careful questions about estate planning, about whether our will had been updated, about property values in our neighborhood. I thought about the pill organizer on the kitchen counter, the one I never touched. I went to the kitchen. Margaret's organizer had 7 compartments, each labeled with a day of the week. I opened Tuesday tomorrow. 4 tablets, the way Ryan always prepared it. I recognized 2 of them. The small white oval was her blood pressure medication, and the round peach tablet was her cholesterol pill. Both had been prescribed for years. The other 2 were different. A small blue tablet I didn't recognize and an oblong white capsule with no markings I could see clearly. I photographed them with my phone. Then I put them back. I didn't sleep. The next morning I called Earl before Ryan was awake. I told him everything, sitting in my truck in the driveway with the engine running so I could be sure no one inside could hear. Earl didn't say "I told you so." He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Don't touch the medications," he said. "Don't confront Ryan. Don't change anything he can observe. Have Margaret's blood work drawn today if the doctor can fit you in. And when you get the results, you call me and we call Detective Brewer at the department together. Not before. Earl, Landon Thomas, listen to me. If he's doing what you think he's doing, you confronting him gives him time to destroy evidence, change his story, and potentially hurt your wife or come after your credibility. You are 67 years old, and he will paint you as a grieving husband who lost perspective. You follow the process. You give them nothing to work with except facts. I understood. I designed enough load-bearing structures to know that you don't start removing elements until you understand exactly what each one is holding up. Dr. Holt fit us in that afternoon. She drew blood and sent it to 2 separate labs with a priority flag. She told me results would take 24 to 48 hours. She also quietly substituted the unidentified tablets in Margaret's Tuesday and Wednesday compartments with a matched-size vitamin. After photographing them and sealing the originals in an evidence bag, she said she'd turned over to a patient safety contact at the hospital before. She told me Margaret would be fine without 1 or 2 doses of whatever they were. I took Margaret home. Ryan made dinner. I watched him move through my kitchen the way he had for 3 years, comfortable, proprietary, and I sat at my own table and said almost nothing and let him think whatever he needed to think. 31 hours later, Dr. Holt called my cell phone. I was in the workshop. The toxicology came back. Margaret's blood shows significant levels of clonazepam, that's a benzodiazepam, a sedative consistent with regular daily dosing over an extended period. The concentration suggests she's been receiving approximately 0.5 milligram to a full milligram per day for what could be 1 to 2 years, possibly longer. A pause. Thomas, this did not come from any prescription in her name. I checked with every pharmacy in a 10-mile radius and cross-referenced with her insurance records. There is no legitimate prescription for clonazepam associated with your wife. What would happen if she stopped taking it? Mild withdrawal symptoms are possible given the duration. Carefully monitored, they're manageable. And cognitive recovery, if chronic exposure has been the primary driver of her symptoms, can begin within days. Some patients show significant improvement within a week. I called Earl. He called Detective Sandra Brewer, who'd worked the elder abuse unit at the Knoxville PD for 8 years. She came to Earl's house that evening, and I walked her through everything. The timeline, the financial collapse, the volunteered caregiving, the unrecognized pills, the toxicology results, Dr. Holt's statement. She listened without interrupting. She asked 3 precise questions and wrote down the answers. We'll need formal statements from you and Mrs. Hadley once she's clear enough to give one. I'm going to pull Ryan's financial records tonight. I have a contact at the DA's office who can move this fast given the medical evidence. If the debt picture looks like what you're describing and the forensic pharmacist confirms the tablets you photographed are clonazepam, we'll have enough for elder abuse and criminal poisoning charges. She looked at me carefully. Can you go home tonight and behave as if nothing has happened? I told her I'd spent 31 years calculating tolerances and working within constraints I didn't design. I could manage 1 more night. Ryan was watching television when I got home. He asked where I'd been. I said I'd had a beer with Earl. He nodded and went back to his show. I sat in the armchair across from him and looked at the side of his face, the face I'd watched change from infant to boy to man, and I thought about the moment at his high school graduation when he'd found me in the crowd and given me a look that said everything words couldn't, the particular pride of a son who knows his father is watching. I thought about teaching him to drive in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday morning, both of us laughing when he clipped a parking block and the hubcap spun across the asphalt. I thought about the phone call from Nashville where he'd told me the business was gone and his voice had cracked and I'd said, "Come home, son. Just come home." I'd meant it as an unconditional offer. I hadn't understood then that he'd arrived with conditions of his own. 4 days later, Margaret woke up before me. I found her in the kitchen, standing at the window that looks out over her flower garden, holding a mug of coffee she'd made herself. She turned when she heard me on the stairs, and the quality of her attention was different, more present, more focused. It's difficult to describe what it looks like when someone you love comes back from somewhere very far away, but it looks like that, like a light that has been dimming for so long you've forgotten what full brightness looked like. And then suddenly you remember. I had the strangest dream, she said. I dreamed I was in a house I didn't recognize, and I kept trying to find a door that led back to our house, but I couldn't find it. And then I just found it. She looked at me with eyes that were clear and sharp and a little frightened. Thomas, how long have I been like this? Like the way I've been? I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. A while, sweetheart. 2.5 years. That's not right, she said slowly. That doesn't feel right. It feels like I've been asleep. She set down her mug. I remember trying to talk to you sometimes, and the words not coming. I remember knowing what I wanted to say, and not being able to reach it. I remember being so scared. Her voice tightened. I'm still scared, but differently. Ryan came downstairs 40 minutes later to find his mother asking me detailed questions about our retirement accounts, questions she hadn't asked in over 2 years. He went very still in the doorway of the kitchen, holding his phone, watching her with an expression I can only describe as calculating through something that looked like alarm. Mom, you seem sharp this morning, he said carefully. I feel sharp, she said. She smiled at him, and it didn't reach her eyes. I'm not certain she knew yet, consciously, what had been done to her. But Margaret had been a 4th-grade teacher for 26 years. She knew when something was wrong in a room. She could read a child's face from across a classroom and know whether the homework wasn't done or whether something much worse was happening at home. She looked at her son the way she had looked at those children, and she held that smile, and she said nothing that indicated she knew anything at all. I excused myself to call Claire from the back porch. She'd known nothing. I'd kept her from worrying, told her the doctors were managing things, told her not to upend her life in Portland for something we were handling. Standing in my own backyard, looking at Margaret's dormant flower beds, I told Claire everything in 11 minutes. The silence on the other end of the line lasted a long time. Dad. Her voice was shaking. Dad, I'm going to fly out. Not yet. I need you to wait 3 more days. I need you to trust me that this is being handled. Is Mom safe right now? She's in the house. She's not taking the medication anymore. She's getting better. Another long silence. What about Ryan? Ryan is in the house too. Dad. He doesn't know we know. That matters. 3 days, Claire. She agreed. I could hear what it cost her. Detective Brewer called that afternoon. The forensic analysis of the photographed tablets had confirmed clonazepam. Ryan's financial records showed $214,000 in outstanding debt across 4 creditors, 2 of which had begun garnishment proceedings on his wages 3 months ago, wages from a part-time consulting position that paid almost nothing. She had also found, through a search of estate planning records, that Ryan had consulted an attorney twice in the past year about the process of petitioning for guardianship of an elderly parent with documented cognitive decline. He'd submitted preliminary paperwork in both instances and withdrawn it before the petitions were filed. He was planning it, I said. He was testing the water, she said. We'll have the warrant by Thursday morning. I'd like you to let him come and go normally until then. Don't let him know you've altered the medication routine, and don't give him any reason to leave the house or dispose of anything. All right. And Thomas, I want to be direct with you. This is a serious case. The DA has reviewed the medical evidence and the financial motive, and we are looking at elder abuse, criminal administration of a harmful substance, and depending on how the forensic pathologist weighs the long-term exposure, potentially reckless endangerment or aggravated assault. If the evidence holds, and I believe it will, your son will be charged with multiple felonies. I stood in my backyard in the cold November air and let that settle into my chest where it would live for a very long time. I know, I said. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of late autumn morning that makes Knoxville feel older and quieter than it really is. Margaret was at the kitchen table working a crossword puzzle. When I came downstairs, the same puzzle she'd been staring at for 3 weeks without completing a single answer had 12 clues filled in now, in her handwriting, deliberate and sure. She looked up at me and raised an eyebrow, and I nodded almost imperceptibly. And she put the pencil down and folded her hands on the table. Ryan came down at 8:45. He poured coffee and stood at the counter scrolling through his phone. He'd been quieter this week. I'd noticed it. The slight recalibration of his behavior. The way he watched his mother without appearing to watch her, trying to understand what the change in her clarity meant for a plan that depended on her declining. The knock at the front door came at 9:15. Ryan turned from the counter. I stood up from the table. Margaret sat very still. I opened the door to Detective Brewer and two uniformed officers. Behind them, Earl Whitmore stood in his driveway across the street with his arms folded, watching. I heard Ryan put his coffee mug down on the counter. Heard his footsteps cross the kitchen. Heard him stop when he reached the doorway and understood what he was seeing. Ryan Hadley, Detective Brewer said, "You're under arrest for elder abuse, criminal administration of a harmful substance, and fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." What happened next is something I have replayed more times than I can count, in the quiet of the workshop late at night when sleep won't come, trying to find some angle from which it looks different than it does. Ryan's composure broke entirely and immediately, the way a load-bearing wall goes when the calculation was wrong all along. He looked at me, not at Detective Brewer, not at the officers, but at me, and his face held nothing but a grief that may or may not have been genuine, and I honestly could not tell you which possibility was worse. "Dad," he said. "Dad, please. I'm sorry. I know what I did. I know what I did to Mom. Please." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Margaret made a sound behind me, a small, involuntary sound, and I turned back to her and took her hand and held it while one of the officers guided Ryan toward the door and Detective Brewer explained the booking process. He didn't fight. He didn't threaten. He went out the front door of the house where he'd grown up and where he'd lived for 3 years while systematically dismantling his mother's mind, and we watched through the window as they helped him into the back of the unmarked car. The neighbors had noticed. Mrs. Fallon from 2 doors down was standing on her porch. The Hendersons' car was parked at the curb, and I could see 2 faces in the front seat. I didn't care. I cared about nothing outside the 4 walls of my kitchen, and the woman sitting at the table with her hands folded and tears running silently down her face. Claire arrived that evening on the last flight from Portland. She walked through the front door and went straight to her mother and held her without saying a word for a long time. Then she pulled back and looked at Margaret's face, really looked at it, the way you look at someone you've been afraid of losing, and said, "Mom, your eyes are clear." "I know," Margaret said. "You're back. I'm back." In the months that followed, I learned things about grief that my previous experience with it hadn't prepared me for. I'd lost my parents, my father-in-law, 2 close friends to illness. I knew grief as an ending, the absence of someone who was gone. This was different. Ryan wasn't gone. He was present, specific, still reachable by phone during designated hours from the correctional facility 40 minutes from our house where he sat awaiting trial. His absence was a choice that had come from a series of other choices, and understanding that didn't make it simpler. It made it more complicated in ways I couldn't always articulate at the Thursday breakfast table when Earl asked how I was doing and I had to think for a while before answering. Margaret's recovery was not instant, and it was not smooth. The clonazepam had been in her system for what the forensic pharmacologist ultimately determined was closer to 2 years of active dosing, and the withdrawal, though medically managed and mild by clinical standards, was uncomfortable and frightening for her. There were a few days in the first week when she was more confused than before, and I sat beside her and held her hand and told her what was happening and why, and she looked at me with eyes that were scared but trusting and said, "Tell me again. I want to understand it again." So I told her again, as many times as she needed. By the 4th week, she was doing the crossword in pen. By the 8th week, she called Claire on a Thursday morning, unprompted, just to talk. I sat in the next room and listened to the sound of my wife's voice, animated, precise, laughing at something Claire said about the grandkids, and I had to set down my coffee and look at the ceiling for a moment. Dr. Holt saw Margaret monthly through the recovery. "What you're watching is not a miracle," she told us at the 3-month appointment. "It's simply the absence of what was suppressing her. The brain is resilient. She's doing the work." The trial was scheduled for the following spring, and unlike what I'd seen happen in some cases I'd read about, there was no dramatic courtroom collapse, no last-minute guilty plea during opening statements. Ryan sat through the proceedings with an attorney who did his job professionally and without flourish, and the prosecution laid out the evidence methodically. toxicology reports, pharmacy records, financial records, Dr. Holt's expert testimony, the tablets that had been photographed and analyzed, the attorney consultations about guardianship that Ryan had pursued and withdrawn twice in 12 months. The jury deliberated for less than a day. He was convicted on all counts. The judge, a man in his late 60s named Robert Caldwell, who had the bearing of someone who had seen every variety of human failure and remained unimpressed by all of it, sentenced Ryan to 9 years in state prison, with 3 years of probation to follow. He ordered full restitution for medical costs, legal fees, and what the court assessed as quantifiable damages for the 2.5 years of Margaret's professional, cognitive, and personal life that had been taken from her. 9 years was more than the prosecution had asked for. Judge Caldwell said, before bringing the gavel down, that betraying a parent's trust was a serious offense. Betraying a parent who was caring for a sick spouse and trusting a child to help was something worse than serious, and the sentence would reflect that. Ryan looked at me from across the courtroom when it was over. I held his gaze because I owed him that much, and I looked away first because I owed myself that much too. Margaret started volunteering at a literacy program at the public library in January, 3 months after the verdict. She goes on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, works with adults learning to read for the first time or relearning after injury or illness. She comes home talking about her students with the same energy she brought home from the elementary school for 26 years. I pick her up on Tuesdays because I like the drive, and sometimes we stop for lunch at a place on Market Street that has a patio where you can watch the river. Claire relocated her family to Knoxville in February. She said it was because of the grandchildren and the quality of the schools and a job opportunity her husband had found, and all of that was true, and none of that was the whole reason. I didn't ask her to explain further. I was glad she was here. Earl and I still have breakfast every Thursday. He asked me once, a few months after the trial, whether I ever wished I hadn't found out, whether there was a version of the ending where ignorance might have been kinder. I thought about it honestly before answering. I thought about Margaret standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee she'd made herself. I thought about her doing the crossword in pen. I thought about the phone calls with Claire and the Tuesday mornings at the library and the way she sometimes looks up from her book in the evenings and finds me watching her and smiles, the exact smile I fell in love with 40 years ago. No, I said. There's no version where not knowing was kinder. Not knowing was the problem. Earl nodded. He stirred his coffee. You did right, Thomas. Maybe. I destroyed my son's life to save my wife's, and I believe it was the only thing to do, and I will live with both of those facts for the rest of the time I have. That is the part the resolution doesn't resolve, the part that sits in the workshop at 2 a.m, the part that picks up the phone sometimes and then puts it down, the part that watches Margaret sleep and feels the full weight of what was almost lost and what was lost in saving it. If you're watching this and something feels wrong, if someone you love is changing faster than age accounts for, if one family member has quietly become indispensable to another's medical routine, if questions about finances and property and legal arrangements are being raised before there's any obvious reason to raise them, pay attention to that feeling. The people who love us are not always the people who are good for us. Sometimes the most dangerous presence in a vulnerable person's life is wearing the face of someone we raised, someone we trust without thinking about it, someone whose motives we can't bring ourselves to examine because the examination itself would break something we can't afford to lose. Don't wait for the breaking. Look now, while there's still time to save both. If this story reached you somewhere true, share it with someone you think might need to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to make a choice between protecting someone you love and protecting someone else you love just as much. I read every one of them. And subscribe to kt-sweetrevenge, where every story we tell is a reminder that truth, however long it takes, has a way of finding its way out.